Hello. In this post, I'm going to be talking about the three layers of the lost generation of children. When people speak of a lost generation of children in the media, this phrase lost generation can sound somewhat exaggerated, as if it has been lifted out of a dystopian movie. But actually, it describes a situation that is real. And what's more, we've been here before, 100 years ago. The author Gertrude Stein, who lived in Paris in the early 20th century, first coined the term lost generation to refer to the people who'd been born between 1883 and 1900. These were the people who were conscripted in 1914 to fight in the Great War, World War I, and most of them were very young when they died on the battlefields. The war veterans who had served and survived then faced the Spanish flu pandemic of 1919, and later in life they saw the rise of fascism. The lost generation phrase was also used by Ernest Hemingway in his 1926 novel The Sun Also Rises. He described the survivors of World War I as those who were disoriented in so many ways, and with their health weakened by the war, were very susceptible to the 1919 pandemic. Let's fast forward to our own time. In July 2020, Anne Longfield, who was the Children's Commissioner for England, predicted that we would see a lost generation of children, those generation who had fallen through the gaps in school and social care systems. And this is what she said. We must not look back in 5 years at a generation of vulnerable teenagers who fell out of society and ended up in crime and unemployment. They need extra help now as we emerge from lockdown. That same year, Cathy Cresswell, Professor of Developmental Clinical Psychology at Oxford, noted the rising number of children living in poverty, and she said, "We have failed to listen and respond to these families." And she continued, "We have a whole generation at risk of being unheard, devalued and forgotten." The UK government SAGE group of advisors also referred to the lost generation. Professor Russell Viner, president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, said, "This is a generation under threat. It will be catastrophically, disproportionately hit and harmed by the loss of economic and social opportunities as a direct result of the pandemic." And Professor Chris Bonnell said, "We not only took away the protective net we throw around our children by closing schools and redeploying the children's health workforce, but then we mortgaged off their futures." And 1 month later, in 2020, November, UNICEF published a report called Averting a Lost COVID Generation, with warnings of lifelong impacts of child malnutrition, child poverty, loss of health and social care for children, and school closures worldwide. 5 years on from Anne Longfield's report, in which she predicted the lost generation, this phrase, lost generation, has also been used by the United Nations to refer to the children of Gaza, and most recently, the same phrase has been used by journalists and politicians to describe the special educational needs crisis in English schools. Although the special educational needs crisis may be the glaring face of the lost generation of children, there are in fact 3 layers of this crisis that we need to consider. Firstly, there's the crisis in school attendance and the sort of relation to this, which is the rise in homeschooling. And at the heart of the lost generation crisis, we have the problems with special educational needs and mental health. And the third part, the last layer, is the crisis in learning engagement. And these 3 layers do overlap, but I'm going to take them one at a time because even though they're very closely linked and very complex, they're also very detailed and we need to look at them in depth. We hear about the failings in children's services and other agencies in high-profile court cases at the moment, following the tragic deaths of innocent children 5 years on after Anne Longfield's report. As a volunteer call taker on a national helpline, it's really obvious to me that these failings in our agencies are affecting families up and down the country. As a result of the pandemic, there are so many parents of teens who are crying out for support. And parents are turning to children's services, they're turning to schools, they're turning to CAMS, just to find that their child is one of so many that need urgent help and support. And in visiting schools on the other side of the coin, I know that low-level behaviour of teens is also causing immense problems in the schools, and there's a problem with retaining and recruiting teachers right now. So many families are enduring fear inside their own homes with their raging teens. Before the pandemic, these children enjoyed school. They loved sports, they did their homework, and they had a nice group of friends. And according to their parents, as teens, they are now disengaged. They're unable to learn. Some of them are unable to get out of bed and are not at school. As a society, we don't appear to have the resources to manage this situation well. Like the previous lost generation of 100 years ago, there are increasing numbers of vulnerable people who are now living in a disoriented, destabilized, and dislocated way. But unlike the previous era of post-pandemic recovery, we also have the rampant acceleration of digital technology. And as a society, we are immersed in all kinds of information. Whatever it is that we search for, an algorithm will deliver more and more of that one thing. Of course, bored teens experiment, just as they have always done. So when a moment of morbid curiosity triggers an algorithm, there is the potential for that teen to descend into a powerful obsession, particularly if that child is already vulnerable in some way. Let's think about the parents. Parents who do not work because they cannot leave their teenager home alone are struggling to pay their household bills, and if they're unable to get their teen into school, they must then pay fines. So it's not surprising that they feel that the only option available to them is to homeschool their teen. The child's behaviour, though, often proves to be too much for a single parent, usually the mother, and the teenager is then sent to live with the other parent or with other family members. And this is the part of the situation that is the most concerning. Local authorities have no way of checking how many children have opted out of the school system once they move into a different area. And in a literal sense, this group of children is lost in terms of their actual location, their educational outcomes, their social development, their welfare, and their well-being. In my opinion, homeschooling can be a really good option when it's done very well. And during the pandemic, I remember seeing reports on BBC News of children who thrived when they were homeschooled. These children felt more calm, more centred, and they were generally enjoying learning at home because it offered a quieter environment for them. However, at the end of the lockdowns, many children tended not to return to school, particularly if they had just transferred from primary to secondary school in 2020 or were just about to do so. There's actually a lot of data from the past 30 years to show that children who have a difficult experience in transferring from primary to secondary school, known as school transition, they often do less well socially, and they have lower educational outcomes at age 16. And I would say that we are seeing this well-known pattern playing out right now. So I hope that this paints a picture of the lost generation of children in terms of a crisis in school attendance and homeschooling, which is my first layer. We need to remember that this is not just about the children, but it also has a devastating effect on the parents too, and their livelihoods can be lost, even their homes. Sometimes there can be a breakdown in the relationship between the school and the family. And there can be very powerful underlying reasons for challenging behaviours that the parents and the schools are managing. For example, if undiagnosed special educational needs or mental health issues are at the root of the problem, then obviously the school special educational needs and disability department and the pastoral team need to step up and agree on a specific plan of support. But the problem is that this is only warranted once the child has been assessed. And while they wait for their assessment, in the meantime, there are spiraling behaviours. The behaviours just drop lower and lower and impact the child in a more and more severe way. The family are also affected. Teaching and learning in the school is affected. And this is the topic of the next post in this series. I'll see you there.